so you're obviously being silly about that. And then seems to be implying in turn that that is blasphemy against the Spirit, because that's the Holy Spirit sort of showing them evidence, as it were, to work on them, to convert them, and they're deliberately ignoring it. And they seem to be being deliberately obtuse at ignoring it by coming up with an argument that doesn't seem to make any sense. Today I have read chapter 12 from the Gospel of Matthew, and again we've generated an enormous amount of difficult stuff to wrestle with from this quite short part again. This one opens with Jesus and his disciples walking through a cornfield, and somehow the Pharisees are observing this and see the disciples picking some of the corn and eating it. But it's on the Sabbath, and it seems that this is deemed to be some sort of harvesting, therefore work, therefore it's not allowed. So the Pharisees kick off to Jesus, saying that they're breaking the Sabbath, this is terrible. This does seem a rather uptight interpretation of all that, but handily Jesus clarifies for us. And he goes back to them and points out that this is very, very silly on the grounds of Hosea 6, chapter 6, verse 6. It talks about, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, which is what God said in that bit through Hosea. And Jesus points out that if the Pharisees had known what those words meant, then they wouldn't have condemned innocent people. So, yeah, it's interesting. Whilst the bar has come up for everything, suddenly this is one that's like, no, that's just silly. He gives them a slap and basically move on. Jesus then goes to heal the hand of someone who's got something going wrong with that. And the Pharisees are not happy about this either, because this is healing, therefore it is some sort of work as well. They're not happy about that. So Jesus points out, if your sheep falls down a hole on the Sabbath, you're going to get it out, aren't you? And people are worth more than sheep, therefore healing a person on the Sabbath is perfectly okay. It basically just tells them, sod off and stop being so silly. But they take this and they're so uptight by this. And they decide from here they're going to plot to kill him, which Jesus seems to realise and decides he's going to leave. Interestingly, despite the fact Jesus has come to die, I guess that's not been made particularly clear yet. I mean, it has in the Old Testament, but it's not clear in this context yet. But it's certainly clearly not time for things yet. There's an interesting bit in here where Jesus talks about the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath as well. And it occurred that the word Lord in the Old Testament is quite often it's a substitution for the word Yahweh, because I think the Jewish people didn't like to use the word Yahweh because it just seemed rife with opportunities for blasphemy by accident. So I looked this up in my super Greek English translation of the New Testament, and the word Lord here is krios, something like that, but the word for God is theos. So it is using a different word, as in this isn't Jesus actually claiming to be God, with the sort of subtle subtext of calling himself Lord, as it might have been in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, that's not the thing. So the krios version of that seems to just mean like the boss, basically. So yeah, that doesn't really help with that, but it is an interesting distinction in how the language translates from the Old and New Testament. This did make me wonder about the Pharisees. So I think part of being open-minded about stuff is looking at something. Is there something in there that is reasonable and makes sense? Is there a grain of something that's driving some weird behaviour, perhaps, but you can see where it's coming from? And in that context, are the Pharisees reasonable in any way for the way they are really adversely against Jesus? I mean, this guy comes along, seems like a very cool dude, saying some very nice stuff, helping a lot of people, breaking some rules as far as they're concerned. So, I mean, that's clearly what they're reacting to. But it's in the context of helping people and clarifying things. So it does seem like a gross overreaction on their part. So, oh no, we're just going to kill him because he's doing this. So would you not look at that and think, oh, okay, maybe we should be listening to this guy because he's doing miraculous things? But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. Jesus points out that they're a brood of vipers, the same as John the Baptist said. They're clearly really dodgy. So yeah, I guess that's probably the answer, that no, they don't have a reasonable grounding for this. There's an interesting bit in this that gets a bit silly on the prophecy front, where Jesus he goes on and does a load more healing, which is all great and fine. But it talks about he's saying to all these people that they really mustn't tell people. And it seems to be that Matthew, the author here, talks about this being linked with Isaiah 42, which we looked at obviously some time ago. But in that it said this thing about this Messiah who was coming was not going to cry out in the streets and that sort of thing. So it's another one of these prophecies that is claiming to be fulfilled by Jesus. But again, it's that sort of thing where Jesus is deliberately doing things, or seemingly deliberately doing things, in order to fulfill a prophecy, which in my head sort of somewhat undermines the validity or sincerity of the fulfillment. But I don't know that particularly matters. It's just that slightly irritating thing with prophecy. But anyway, we do get Jesus then drives out another demon, and the people, it says, who witness this, starting to ask the question, could this guy be the son of David? Not the literal son of David, but the prophesied in the Old Testament that this guy was going to be a descendant of David. And people are starting to ask that now. So I guess Jesus has a plan in terms of gently spreading the word, as it were, by resurrecting people and all that sort of thing. But it just seems to be working. We have an interesting clash, though, with the Pharisees again, where the Pharisees accuse him of using the power of beezlebul to drive out these demons from people. And Jesus comes along and points out, well, no, that's just silly, isn't it? Because he obviously say, if Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. And then he points out that's sort of logically self-defeating or something like that. This beezlebul guy, I looked him up. He seems to be sort of a distortion of beelzebub. We talked about a long, long time ago. I think Kings, I think that was. And that sounds a bit like Beelzebub, which sounds a bit like Satan, that sort of thing. So it sounds like there's some sort of satanic thing. But the way Jesus is talking about Beelzebul and Satan, and he seems to be potentially linking the two, it would seem to suggest that he's implicitly implying that this guy is real. So Baal from the Old Testament, the silly made-up god I've been making fun of all the time, sounds like Jesus is almost suggesting he was real but it was a demon rather than a god. So yeah, I mean, back from I think it was the second tangent on the exorcism stuff. I struggle more with the idea of the demons and ghouls and all the rest of it than I do with the idea of God existing. So I just have to just sort of move on, I guess. But we have to sort of note along the way that Jesus does seem to be suggesting that this stuff is real. Actually, Jesus also says in part of this that he knows the Pharisees' thoughts, which is very interesting because we've had in, where was it, Psalms or Kings or something like that. There was talk in the Old Testament anyway that only God knows what's in people's hearts and minds, that sort of thing. And it's saying here that Jesus knows this. I don't think Jesus is saying it. I think it's Matthew saying that Jesus knows this. So, it's not Jesus claiming that, but it is again another implication that suggests that it's on the side of the argument to lean towards Jesus being at least very, very special. And I think it's worth clarifying because there was a question raised like, can demons read minds? But I think because of what it said previously, that only God can do that, that sort of implies that demons can't do that, albeit they might be able to read behaviour quite well and perhaps that sort of thing. I don't know, I'm trying to be careful with the demon thing in case it is real, in the same way as I am for the God stuff in case it's real. But yeah, it's a difficult thing to take seriously when sort of instinctively you want to slightly giggle at the idea of demons and ghosts and all that sort of thing. We then get on to this quite difficult thing of the one unforgivable sin. And I had come across this before, and that is to blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. So Jesus says, every kind of sin and slander can be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. And the context of where he's putting this is in the debate about by what power Jesus is driving out demons. And I've had to go off down the rabbit hole to have a look at, okay, what does it mean to blaspheme against the Holy Spirit? Because, I mean, there's no sort of curse words to do that, is there? So it's not I'm aware of. The best, I guess, the most reasonable sounding explanation I come up with is I've found this talk about to blaspheme against the Spirit is basically to ignore the work of God in your life, sort of thing, something along those lines. So the suggestion here is that Jesus is driving out a demon. The Pharisees are coming up with an excuse for saying, no, that's not because you're God, that's because you're in league with the devil. Jesus then points out that makes no sense. So you're obviously being silly about that. And then seems to be implying in turn that is blasphemy against the Spirit, because that's the Holy Spirit sort of showing them evidence, as it were, to work on them, to convert them, to believe in Jesus. And they're deliberately ignoring it. And they seem to be being deliberately obtuse at ignoring it by coming up with an argument that doesn't seem to make any sense. That being said, I'm not quite sure Jesus' argument that the devil couldn't drive himself out. I mean, yes, in absolute terms, but in a sort of sub-demon, he might sacrifice one of his demons by driving them out with a big... So it's not obvious that necessarily entirely stacks up. But yeah, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, clearly a very bad thing. I guess actually also, and there's an extra point, is that Jesus says it won't be forgiven in this life or the next, which kind of implies that you can sin in heaven, as it were. So I guess on the basis that you surely can't have sinning people in a perfect creation when it's actually functioning perfectly and we've all been filtered through the judgment. It would seem to suggest that you could change your mind. If you're in heaven and you don't want to be anymore, you could leave, I think. I mean, that seems to sort of suggest that, perhaps. We then also have that all will be judged by the words they've used when it comes to Judgment Day. And presumably by more than just their words, but it just seemed to be a suggestion that we need to be a bit careful about what we say. The Pharisees then sort of slightly oddly asked Jesus for a sign. And it seems to be almost in the context of like, okay, we're trying to work with you here. Give us a sign. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is Jesus turns around and just says, what does he say? A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign. So Jesus isn't happy about this. But Jesus has been giving loads of signs, and it seems the Pharisees have seen this because they've seen the demon being driven out, and they've said it's by the power of beezlebul. So, yeah, there's clearly some context there that I'm missing, I guess, because they're asking for a sign. Jesus say no, but they've had several. Maybe they just haven't seen much of it. But anyway, there we go. We then get to we're nearly there, a difficult thing about Jonah, where Jesus talks about likening himself to Jonah, where Jonah spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish and then is vomited up on the beach in Nineveh and goes and saves the city. Jesus is saying, like that, he will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. But whilst I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, given he's just said this, we've got to have a sort of a quick check. Bear in mind, Matthew wrote this, 50 years after all these events. So everything has already happened. Matthew knows what's happened and is obviously writing to fit it all together. Jesus dies on the Friday, so hence we have Good Friday. He's entombed before the sunset, because I think that's part of the Jewish tradition. So that makes sense. So you could say that's a day and a night in the tomb. He's there all day Saturday, and Saturday night. So he's in the tomb 2 days and two nights so far. But on Sunday, he's then resurrected. So he's in there. You could argue, unless you've been really pedantic, that's 3 days. It's certainly on the third day. But you can't argue that's 3 nights. That's 2 nights. And I don't quite know how to reconcile that, because it's not like someone made this up, because it was written years later. It's not a prophecy that someone's trying to fit things into. It was written well over time. Matthew would have been there. Matthew can surely count. So presumably we're going to get in his own account that three days later, i.e. 2 nights later, Jesus gets up again. So we're going to have to find an answer to that, because it sort of bugs me more than I think perhaps it should. It just seems annoyingly inconsistent and a little bit silly and unnecessary to get wrong. And then finally, we have this weird thing about impure spirits, where Jesus seems to imply that if a spirit is knocked out of a body, an impure spirit, and is whizzing around, it then decides, well, I've got nothing else to do, so I might as well go back to where I came from, but then goes and gets 7 of its mates first, who are generally worse, and then the 8 of them go back and re-inhabit this person they've left. I think this is what it's saying. So it seems to be a suggestion almost that there's no point driving out spirits, but Jesus has been doing quite a bit of that. So I've clearly missed something, and yeah, every chapter of Matthew so far comes with bigger and bigger questions. But I guess with each touch of repetition, we hopefully gain a little bit more understanding. We just understand that there's more that we don't understand, I guess, something like that. But yes, onwards we shall go and see if we can figure some more of this stuff out.